Welcome everyone, welcome to week 10. Our teaching assistants today are these two adorable foster rabbits that are currently in my home. That's Frosty and Pierogi, available for adoption through Tiny Paws Rabbit Rescue if any of you are looking for a very active companion or two. So this week we're going to cover the second part of the research evidence component of evidence-based practice. If you'll remember from last week, there are 4 steps to accessing and applying research. Last week we covered the first 2, formulating a research question and searching for evidence. And then this week we're going to cover steps 3 and 4, how to critically appraise the evidence and how to use the evidence in your practice. Before we get into that though, we need to cover some components in terms of what you will find when you look through the research literature. Journal articles in general are divided into these components listed here. The abstract is usually just a short summary paragraph that describes the key findings of the article. And then you have the actual article itself, which begins with the introduction, where it states the research questions and provides a clear definition of the topic or problem area and the past research that's been conducted in the area. The next section is typically the methods, where there's a description of the sample, how the study was conducted, what tools were used. It should be a clear explanation for why the study was conducted the way it was, and it should be detailed enough that someone just reading the article could replicate it if they so chose and still be able to get similar results. The next step is the results, which are the major findings of the article. Depending on how quantitative or qualitative the article is, this might be very technical language. So then there's the discussion or implications, which takes the results and basically situates them within the existing research literature and explains how they might be different or what they add to the existing literature and how the results can be used in practice or for further research. And then there should also be a limitations section. If there's no limitations section or a limitations paragraph, that's a very, very bad thing, because all articles, all research has limitations, and you have to acknowledge those because they really impact the knowledge claim that you're able to make with your research findings. So what I want you to do now is actually stop the recording and do a quick search using your research question that you came up with last week and the PICO terms that you identified. And do that quick search and choose 1 or 2 articles from your research that could answer your research question. And then hold on to those articles. And as we go through the next few slides, refer to your articles and do an assessment. Consider how good or how high the quality of the articles is. So this is where we get into that step 3. So distinguishing which studies are more reliable based on their methodology and how they can answer your research questions. You can't just read an article and take for granted that what it says is accurate. You have to critically assess and critically think about what their findings are and whether their findings are actually accurate or not. Despite the fact that they've usually undergone a peer review process, there can be quite significant flaws in the peer review process. So in order to know whether an article is of high quality or not, I will now show you some things to look out for. So when it comes to quantitative research, this is where we use data to gather evidence and test a theory, usually with a large sample size and standardized instruments. This can be very helpful in figuring out the relationship between variables while accounting for extraneous variables or things that are not as important. However, the limitation to quantitative research is that it really simplifies very complex realities. So the descriptions, meanings, and individual perspectives tend to be missing. However, because it's usually based on very large samples, the results, if the sample was collected correctly, can be generalizable to larger populations. On the other hand, qualitative research helps to develop ideas, to develop theory as opposed to testing it. It's usually based on a smaller number of cases, and it involves interviews, focus groups, etc., with participants in order to get their feedback or story. And then you analyze the qualitative information in order to build and explain theories. It's quite subjective and it includes personal perspectives. So when you're reading qualitative research, there's always a paragraph where the researchers identify their own positionality and how that might influence the research findings in recognition of the fact that this is a very subjective process. As a result, qualitative findings are very rarely generalizable, and they tend to lack validity and reliability. They're also very time-consuming to do, and they're quite hard to replicate because they're based on a very specific sample of individuals. On the other hand, they are able to provide you with that perspective that's very important in understanding how people are impacted by various treatments, interventions, or programs. So, depending on the type of research question you have, you're going to be looking for either quantitative research or qualitative research. If your research question is based on the effectiveness of an intervention, you're going to be looking for quantitative research. If your research question is based on how a certain population feels about an experience, then you're going to be looking for qualitative research to answer your research questions. This slide presents just very broadly all of the different types of research questions and what type of study you want to find in order to answer that research question. This slide is very important for you to refer back to. It is basically a summary of what we covered last week. So if you're looking for effectiveness, the best thing to do is find a systematic review or a meta-analysis. Least effective are things like correlational studies or anecdotal case reports, client surveys, things like that. So for each type of research question here, I've compiled the types of research studies that you want to be looking at and that you want to use in your fact sheets. You want the most desirable, not the least desirable, in order to answer your research question. And then you need to critically appraise the research. So based on those charts that I just showed you in your findings, does the research you have found correspond to your research question? Now, to critically appraise the research isn't just a binary yes-no process. You actually have to assess two areas. You have to assess whether the article actually links to your research question, so does the research match the most desired methodology, or is it a less desirable methodology? And then you also have to consider the quality of the research. Is it a well-written article? Does it include all of the components I listed earlier? Is there a limitation section that identifies any weaknesses of the research? Or does it have a gross overreach and make impossible statements? So you have to consider all of that. Here are some more questions to consider when you're judging the quality of the research. For instance, consider for the sample that is based on that research study, who was surveyed. Are they similar to the participants that you were curious about in your research question, or are they quite different? Where was the research carried out? Is it an urban-rural setting, Canada, US, somewhere else? Is it a region that's comparable to where your agency practice is in your research question? Consider also the methodology and what are the limitations of this type of methodology, and consider whether the analyses are valid or not. So this is going to be a little bit trickier for you to do, but look at the methods, for instance. Are they describing their measures adequately? Is it possible for you, just as a reader, to imagine how you would conduct the same study, or is there so little detail that that would be impossible? So that could help you determine whether that's a good quality study or a poor study. You also want to look at the findings. What results were significant and what were non-significant? Are the findings generalizable? So can we make predictions about the future based on the past events, or can we make predictions about other populations based on this sample? If it's qualitative research, what were the themes that arose? Would they be relevant to the population that your research question is about? And then you also want to consider how the findings fit into the wider literature. Do they build onto it? Are they in the same vein, or do they completely contradict everything that's been found before? And lastly, you want to consider what are the author's implications for practice and future research. If they don't have any, that's not great research. And again, there should be limitations listed in there, and if there aren't, that's another red flag. So that's how we basically analyze and appraise the evidence. And in this week's live class, we're going to discuss how you can use the evidence in your practice and whether the evidence makes sense to use in your case.